All right, Queen Victoria and the British Empire. So on your fill in the blank note sheets, all of these words will be in order. Victoria became Queen of England at the age of 18 in the year 1837. She was the granddaughter of King George III. We've talked about him before. He was the King of England during the American Revolution and also during the War of 1812. Her husband's name was Prince Albert. He was from Germany. A lot of times you had a queen of one country and a king or a prince of another country getting married to make an alliance between two countries. They ended up having 9 children during their marriage. Victoria and Albert established a tone of politeness and proper behavior, public decency, that became known as the Victorian Age. A lot of what we see as British stereotypes, being very proper, that came from the Victorian Age. And in doing so, created a model of loving family life, became the example for British people to follow. So this time is seen as a time of proper speech, proper behavior that was very different from the 1700s. That was a time of a lot more vice than the 1800s when she was queen. So she had very strict standards of personal morality, and that rubbed off on society. There were several famous authors during her time as queen, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Charles Dickens. And also you have the first ever stamp printed in 1840 that bore her face. The first ever lickable stamp that you put on an envelope had her face on it. Now, Albert died after they had been married for about 20 years. Victoria was very overcome with grief, so much so that she actually secluded herself from the public for years and ended up wearing black silk on her outfit every single day for the rest of her life, which was over 40 years, because she was so in grief about the death of her husband. Now, despite her long period of grief, she did remain a very popular queen. She was recognized by most of Europe as very competent, and she became known as the grandmother of Europe because most of her children married into royal and noble families all across Europe. In the late 1600s, Great Britain became a constitutional monarchy. I think we've talked about that before, where you have both a monarch and a parliament, an elected parliament. British monarchs of the 1700s and early 1800s had tried to kind of control parliament, but during Victoria's reign, the idea of democracy had really spread throughout a lot of the world, and she responded to her people's desire for more of a democratic society by shifting political power from herself to the parliament. And this is still how Britain is today. It's pretty rare to find someone who will shift power away from themselves to make themselves less powerful, but that is what Victoria did. Now, when Victoria took the throne, only about 5% of the British population was allowed to vote for members of parliament. Victoria worked to expand suffrage, which means the right to vote, during her years as queen, and by 1884, nearly all men in Britain had the right to vote. Most other European countries had similar kind of progress in the 19th century, and then going into the early 20th century or the early 1900s, most European nations gave women the right to vote as well. The British Empire was very much anti-slavery during her time as queen. Remember, William Wilberforce led the effort to abolish the slave trade, and then Britain became the world leaders in ridding the world of slavery, and Victoria was all on board there. And they were advocates for freedom around the world. In fact, during the American Civil War, Victoria had considered supporting the Confederacy, but what changed her mind was when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This made it clear to her that the war was actually about slavery, and therefore she said, I can't support the Confederacy. I can't support a side that is fighting to protect such a wicked institution. And so she and Parliament decided that Britain would stay neutral, and that really affected the outcome of the American Civil War. During the Victorian era, Britain was arguably the most powerful country in the world. The British Empire reached the height of its wealth and power during her 64 years on the throne. Her reign was a period of a lot of progress, both industrial and cultural changes. You have political, scientific, and military shifts occurring within the United Kingdom, and it was also marked by a great expansion of the British Empire. It was the height of the age of imperialism. A lot of that took place while she was queen. While she was queen, it was said that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and this means that Britain had colonies all around the world. So it was always daytime somewhere in the British Empire, if not in England itself, then in one or more of its colonies across the globe. Britain controlled about half of Africa, including Egypt and South Africa. It controlled Ireland. India was its largest colony. You also have Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and several more colonies too. The British Empire controlled land on 6 continents, and so in addition to being Queen of England, Victoria also had many other titles. She was the queen of all these other nations as well, and she also became the Empress of India in 1876. That was always her favorite title. Here is a map of the British Empire during Victoria's reign. So all of that territory in the red was British territory at the time of its the height of its territorial expansion. And she did not travel to many of those places. She kind of ruled this massive empire that was 20% of the world from her sitting room in her palace. In the British colonies of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, British colonists dominated the population. They were settler colonies. And as Britain industrialized and prospered, these colonies did too. Australia was initially a colony for prisoners. It was a penal colony since England's prisons were overcrowded. After their release, convicts would purchase land, they would settle in Australia, and eventually British settlers joined the former convicts in both Australia and New Zealand. One thing that helped the economy boom there was the sheep and wool industry. That helped Britain's economy and encouraged a lot of people to move there. Victoria encouraged immigration to these settler colonies by offering settlers cheap land. There was also a gold rush in Australia in 1851, which made a lot of people move there. Victoria reigned for a total of 64 years, from 1837 until her death in 1901. So this is seen as one of the best examples of imperialism. It lasted for so long, and the British Empire was so powerful during her time as queen. But that doesn't mean that everything that imperialist nations did was good. In fact, there was quite a lot of resistance, both to British imperialism as well as to Japanese and French and German, etc., imperialism from the native people. So if you get out a sheet of notebook paper, you should only need one. This will be pretty short. It's important to understand that colonial governments in Africa, as well as in most other places where Europe had colonies, they were largely run by military officials, by European military officials. It's like it was martial law all the time. And there was a lot of resistance to European rule in Africa. Most Africans thought it was their land, that the Europeans didn't belong there, and so a lot of them tried to fight them to push them out. A lot of times tribes and civilizations, they attempted to remove European presence from their land by force, but every single attempt was unsuccessful until 1918. We'll get to that in a later class, but every attempt for decades and decades was unsuccessful because the Europeans had better military technology than the Africans did. If you just look in that painting there from the war between the Zulus and the British have guns and the Zulus have shields and spears. So during the early years of European imperialism in Africa, there was an Islamic empire called the Sokoto Caliphate, and you see that in the red in the top map. And they strongly resisted the Europeans in that region of Africa. One thing they didn't like about the Europeans was the fact that the Europeans were anti-slavery. Remember, the British were sailing their ships up and down the coast of Africa, plying the seas to intercept any slave ships and free those slaves and take them to Sierra Leone. Well, the Sokoto Caliphate reestablished the slave trade in order to grow their economy. The British Navy wouldn't have any of that, so they intercepted the Sokoto ships carrying slaves. They freed them and relocated them to their colony of Sierra Leone. The Sokoto Caliphate did not take kindly to this. They were the largest African empire since the Songhai Empire, and they fought back against the British, but were finally subdued in 1903 when Britain conquered them and made them a part of their colony of Nigeria. Another example of resistance to imperialism is a group of native people in southern Africa called the Osa People. Yes, that's how you make that X sound in South African phonics. So the Osa people of South Africa did not want to be ruled by Europeans, naturally, and their cattle had gotten diseases from British settlers. Yes, the Europeans did bring new medicine to Africa, but they also brought with them diseases that the Africans did not have immunity to. And not only did African people catch these diseases, but a lot of times their cattle did as well. So the Osa's cattle, they got diseases from British settlers, and the Osa did not understand why. They didn't have germ theory. They didn't really understand science in that way. And they assumed that evil spirits from the Europeans had possessed their cattle, and that's why they were getting diseases. So they reacted by killing their cattle and destroying their crops in the belief that this would cause spirits to remove the British settlers from their land. In reality, this did not do anything. This was called the Osa cattle killing movement. It resulted in 400,000 dead cattle, which naturally led to famine and the death of thousands of people since they did not have the food that they needed anymore. Another example of resistance was the Zulu Kingdom. It's located in South Africa as well. They revolted against the British in the 1870s. The British won the Anglo-Zulu War, and the Zulu lands became part of the British colony of South Africa. Another example of resistance is in Guinea, in northwest Africa. The Mande tribe, their chieftain Samori Toure, he went to war with the French in 1883 and then again in 1891. So the French were able to defeat the Mande. They captured Samori Toure and sent him into exile. So you're seeing a pattern with all of these different resistances to imperialism. Another example would be in Sudan in 1881. A man named Muhammad Ahmad, he declared himself to be the Mahdi, which means the guided one, who would restore the glory of Islam. He believed it was his destiny to restore Islam to Africa, which had been Christianized by the Europeans. Ahmad and his Mahadist forces, they fought against the British and the Egyptians, who fought on the side of the British, and his forces were ultimately defeated in 1898. There was also a female warrior named Ya Asantawa who fought the British in modern-day Ghana in the year 1900. This resulted in thousands of deaths and a British victory. So in addition to a lack of military technology, another major reason why all of these different African efforts to resist European colonization was so unsuccessful is because of their disunity. You remember that tribal map I showed you last class about how many different tribes there were in Africa, and many Africans saw their rival tribes as just as bad as the Europeans. They hated other African tribes just as much as they hated the Europeans, and this disunity was not good for the Africans' hopes of resisting European imperialism. And this started to change a little bit at the end of World War I. We'll get to World War I a little bit later, but when World War I ended in 1918, you had a lot of Western-educated Africans who had gone to Europe, been educated at their universities, and they came back to Africa with all these new ideas, one of which was the idea of PanAfricanism. This is the concept that all Africans have a shared identity, and they should see themselves as Africans first over being a citizen of their tribe or colony. And this concept of Pan-Africanism encouraged many Africans to work together to resist European imperialism instead of fighting amongst each other as well. So the 1900s would actually see the end of all European colonies in Africa. All the European colonies that had been formed in the 1800s By the 1900s, they would be decolonized. The European countries would leave there. But we'll get to that in another unit. So real quick, go to 6.3 in your books. Just a few more things from the chapter I want to highlight here. There were also indigenous responses to state expansion in other parts of the world in addition to Africa. For example, in the Balkan Peninsula, that's in southeastern Europe, the Ottoman Empire had been imperializing there for centuries. And you had an increase in Balkan nationalism that was inspired by the French Revolution. So a lot of different ethnic groups in the Balkans, which is Southeast Europe, they rebelled against the Ottoman Empire. Now, eventually the Ottoman Empire would collapse in 1918 at the end of World War I. So the seeds of this kind of resistance and the end of imperialism has started in Europe as well as in Africa. In the Americas, you also have resistance to the expansion of the United States into Indian territory. There was a lot of resistance among Native Americans. For example, the Cherokee reacted against the Indian Removal Act. There was the Ghost Dance resistance movement. And then you also have the native resistance against Spain in modern-day Peru. There's a man named Tupac Amaru who led a revolt throughout Peru and Bolivia and Argentina. Eventually he was captured, but they were fighting against Spanish occupation of those regions. There was also a resistance movement in Mexico. You have Mexicans conspiring with the Emperor of France to overthrow the Mexican government of Benito Juarez. Eventually, the Mexicans forced the French to withdraw from Mexico, and Juarez resumed the presidency. So a lot of attempts to overthrow whatever power structure was currently there. And then you have the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. Remember, Britain owned India, and they owned it through military rule. Colonial governments were controlled by European military leaders, and there were a lot of Indians who fought for the British military, and they were called sepoys. Now, the sepoys started to react against the British when the British changed the way that they had to put gunpowder in their guns. Okay, so this is kind of specific, but it'll make sense in a second. So the sepoys, since they were from India, were mostly Hindu and Muslim. Well, Hindus do not eat beef, and Muslims do not eat pork. Well, there was a rumor going around, and it turned out to be true in some places, that the British were soaking the gunpowder cartridges in pig fat and in cow fat. Now, why this was a big deal is because in the field of battle, you had to bite the cartridges in order to tear off the top of it in order to pour the gunpowder into your gun. And it would be against the religion of Muslims to put pig fat in their mouths like that, and it would be against the religion of Hindus to put cow fat in their mouths like that. So the sepoys saw this as a British ploy to convert them to Christianity against their will, and so they reacted against it, and they killed thousands of British people. There was this huge mutiny all across the country, and the British responded forcefully to this. Their own people were getting killed for something that they didn't feel was worth murder, okay, didn't justify what the Indians were doing, so they repressed this mutiny very severely as well. And in fact, after this rebellion, the British really tightened their grip on India. They no longer owned it through the East India Company. The British Crown started to rule India directly and have more control over the lives of Indians. And this is known as the British Raj. And this would remain the case in India, being ruled directly from Britain for the next 90 years. There was also Southeast Asian resistance. The Vietnamese resisted French colonialism all the way up until 1954 when the French finally left. You also had resistance in the Philippines, where the Philippines resisted Spanish control. The Philippine Revolution occurred around the time of the Spanish-American War, in which America defeated Spain and gained control of the Philippines, which are in the Pacific. But then you have a war between the Filipinos and the Americans, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, mostly Filipino civilians. You also had resistance in Australia. You had the Aborigines, or the Aboriginal people. There were about 1 million of them, and they resisted the British incursions into their land. However, the government instructed settlers in Australia to treat the indigenous people kindly, but not all of them did what the government told them to do. There's also the issue of the Maori, the native people of New Zealand, and the Maori Wars were when the British fought the native Maori, and by 1900 the Maori had lost most of their land. Okay? The remainder of the chapter talks about African resistance, which we have already gone over. So that is all I have for you.